Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. This is a series of short videos dedicated to Islam and the relationship between Islam and Australia. In the late 19th century, there were two more influxes of Muslim workers: Malays of diverse island origins who worked in the pearl shelling industry in Australia's northern seas, and Javanese Muslims who worked in the new sugarcane plantations in northeastern Queensland. Pearl diving became the largest industry in North Queensland by the 1890s, for which Malays were recruited. The industry spread around the northern coast, Broome in Western Australia becoming the world's major centre and home to various cultures, including Malays, who in the 1930s built a small mosque there. Malays formed long-standing relationships with Indigenous people across the top end of the country. A significant number married local Aboriginal women, and today there are many Aboriginal Malay people in this vast region. The Javanese Muslims were brought as labourers on the sugarcane plantations of northeastern Queensland, centred around Mackay. A pioneering British grower who had worked in Java considered Javanese to be responsible workers and was instrumental in bringing some 2,000 of them by the mid-1880s. They lived in their own Muslim communities. Both women and men came together, observing Islamic religious and cultural practices. Some had made the Hajj to Mecca before coming to Australia. The first generation built in the styles of their homeland, including a bamboo and grass mosque. By the early 20th century, most second-generation Javanese men had become independent market gardeners and cane farmers, gradually integrating into the wider community. During the early 20th century, Muslim marriages in Mackay took place in a registry office with the Islamic nikah ceremony afterwards. The first names of the children were anglicised by the registration office, but their parents also gave them a Muslim name. Bahasa Malay language had been replaced by English. Australia was now their home. The large influx of Islamic immigrants into Australia in the 1970s resulted in an Islamic resurgence among the Australian-born Javanese Muslim community in 1977. The Javanese Muslims formed the Islamic Society of Mackay and in 1980 built a mosque. However, many of the younger generations have been absorbed into mainstream Australian life. Only a few elderly members of the community observe Islam, hoping that their kindling of the faith will be sustained into the future. Several hundred Muslim Malay citizens of Australia live in the Australian-administered territories of the Cocos-Keeling Islands and Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean as well. They are the descendants of workers brought in the 19th century to harvest kofa from coconuts and have maintained much of their own culture and traditions. In recent decades, some have moved to join the Muslim population of Western Australia, where they have built their own mosques. Following the establishment of the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, there was a long period when immigration laws made it almost impossible for non-Europeans to settle into Australia, until new policies were gradually legislated after World War II. Nevertheless, some Muslims from Albania immigrated following the ending of Turkish rule there in 1912. As Europeans, Albanians were not excluded under the White Australia policy. By 1933, there were 770 Albanians in Australia, and their descendant communities now thrive, mainly in Victoria. Muslim conversion is growing very significantly in some Indigenous communities, both urban and rural. The research of an Australian scholar, Peter Stevenson of the University of Melbourne, provides valuable insights into the social and spiritual motives that have brought Indigenous Australians into the international Islamic community. In her recent book, called Islam Dreaming, she observes that Indigenous Muslims are drawn by a neat cultural fit between their traditional beliefs and the teachings of Islam. They find, for instance, cultural parallels in traditional practices of male circumcision, arranged marriages, and polygyny. In Islam, men and women have distinct roles, as is customary with Aboriginal people. There are also similar attitudes towards respecting the environment. Indigenous Muslims appreciate that the Quran states that Allah made human beings into different nations and tribes, and that racial and cultural differences are a part of his plan. There are also gender-specific reasons why Islam appeals to indigenous women. As a consequence of traditional cultural values becoming degraded through European acculturation, indigenous women have long suffered unwanted levels of male attention. So wearing Islamic clothing is a practical as well as a symbolic deterrent. As a public expression of the importance of the family, Islam also appeals to mothers who, against a long history of family rupture in social disenfranchised indigenous communities, want to offer their children security and stability. A similar set of arguments surrounds the appeal of Islam for indigenous men. The Islamic notion of universal brotherhood and its disavowal of racial distinctions led to a growth in self-esteem that has a significant influence on the way men view their roles as husbands and fathers, restoring pride and conferring leadership. For some, the adoption of a faith that demands the avoidance of alcohol, drugs and gambling has also played a very positive turning point in their lives. Islam thus offers indigenous people a strict code of conduct and a moral and ethical framework that they feel connects them to their traditional heritage. An interesting footnote regarding Islam in Australia was that a small group of coins was found on a beach in northwestern Australia dating from either 800 AD or 1300. It's difficult to determine because the name of the Sultan was the same in both of those periods. These Islamic coins were from the city island state of Kilwa off the East African coast. How they got there, nobody knows. I mean, it's really anybody's guess. But probably they came as trade goods with Indonesian fishermen that had visited the northwestern Australian coast. But it's an interesting footnote to show that there is evidence of Islam in Australia, possibly as early as around the year 800. I've talked a little bit about the impact of Islam on the Aboriginal population, the indigenous population of Australia. But of course, around Australia, there's been a real resurgence of Islam in recent years. Many mosques are being built across the country. Some of them are really quite small, almost houses in their design, in the smaller towns, particularly of northern Australia. Some of them are large traditional mosque structures with domes and semi-domes and so on, in the sort of a modern version of an Ottoman style. Here we have some images of some from Sydney and another from the Sunshine Coast in southern Queensland, which interestingly looks quite a lot like the central mosque of the city of Mahachkala in the Republic of Dagestan. These mosques are extremely well attended and have very active congregations who do their best to look after the needs of their own communities, as well as outreach to the non-Muslim world. So there are many events held on a regular basis by these mosques throughout Australia to encourage people to use their libraries, often have very good libraries, to study the Quran, and just to mingle with their Muslim neighbours living around them in the various cities of Australia. Some of them, as you can see from the foliage, are definitely tropical mosques. There are many tropical Muslims in Australia. For instance, there's a huge number of Malays from Malaysia who live in Australia, who studied there. There are immigrants from Pakistan, for instance. There are immigrants from Turkey, from all over the Muslim world. Those that lived in the tropical parts of the world before they came to Australia often gravitate to the tropical parts of Australia. So their mosques have that sort of beautiful tropical feeling with palms and tropical vegetation around them. So this has been a brief overview of Islam and its relationship with Australia. As I've been able to show you, I hope, it stretches over many centuries. There's over 1,000 years of some form of contact of Islam with Australia.